easier just to let the vice chair chair the meeting.
Okay, well, I'll get started. Should I read the meeting instructions, or Andrea, do you wish to do that?
That's okay, I can do it. So meeting is being conducted in accordance with the State of California Executive Order N-29-20 dated March 17th in consideration of the coronavirus. Any attendees who would like to make public comment during the public comment period, you will be given 3 minutes. Please use the raise hand function in Zoom. Or you can email me at andrea.paisano@svcleanenergy.org with any public comment that you would like read into the record. And with that, Chair, we can move on to roll call if you'd like.
Yes, please. Roll call.
Great. Thank you. Chair Rennie?
Here.
Thank you. Vice Chair Makachuk?
Present.
Gibbons?
Here.
Martinez Beltran?
Here.
Klein?
Present.
Thank you. And as Girish mentioned at the start of the meeting, we are missing committee member Trevin Barber, but we do have a quorum of the committee.
Okay. We've got one item on the consent calendar, which is to approve the minutes of the May 3rd, 2021 Finance Administration Committee meeting. I would entertain a motion to, well, I guess I'll call for public comment on that.
Thank you, Vice Chair. We have no current attendees and we did not receive any written public comment for this item.
All right. I'm not sure if there's any comments by the board members, but if not, perhaps we can have a motion to approve the minutes.
Move to approve. This is Siobhan.
Second by Klein.
Okay, we have a first and a second. A roll call vote, please.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair. Chair Rennie?
Yes.
Vice Chair Makachuk?
Aye.
Gibbons?
Aye.
Martinez Beltran?
Aye.
Klein?
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries.
All right. Then moving on with the agenda, we don't have a oral communications in here, no? Question.
Apologies, Vice Chair. We have our CEO update as the item on our regular calendar.
If I may, I think the Vice Chair is looking for something similar to what we do at council meetings, which is to then have an oral request portion of the meeting or public request. And we handle those a little differently. We usually do those at the beginning of the meeting if we have that, right?
I think here we have committee and staff remarks at the end of the meeting before adjournment.
Yeah, he's looking for public.
Oh, public comment. Okay.
Yeah, he's looking for public comments, I think.
Yes, I am. So we'll just move forward with the agenda. I can't see if there's any members of the public that are attending the meeting.
No members, Vice Chair.
Okay, we'll just move on then for simplicity and make it expeditious. So CEO report, please.
So thank you, Vice Chair. So we have two of our major policy issues being teed up for today's agenda, but a quick update that the governor issued an emergency proclamation late last week. It was on Friday, actually, and essentially looking to change some environmental regulations that would allow for backup generation to be utilized in cases where system supply was scarce during the upcoming summer months. The governor has also issued a document which lays out the plan for the electric system of the future. We're still digesting that and also the emergency proclamation. From my first reading of it, it will enhance the reliability of the bulk power grid for the summer. So that's a positive. And we'll provide an update as part of the CEO report at the August board meeting. So you'll be seeing a little bit in the press on that in the next few days. Outside of that, we continue to work on recruiting. That continues to be a challenge, but we're moving forward with an external recruiter and we're getting some good responses there. I'll leave it at that because we do have a rather lengthy, we have quite a bit on our plate for the next few agenda items, and open to any questions you may have.
Any questions for the CEO and his report, his update? Seeing none, we will close that and move on to the third item on the agenda, recommend approval of prepaid transaction. And I believe we're going to have a presentation by our CFO.
That's right. So while Andrea brings up the presentation, let me say that, as you guys know, we've been working on it for a number of months on this transaction. We're at a stage where we've reached commercial agreement on all the major terms with our bank that we've been working with, Morgan Stanley. And also the market is at a point where we can realize the kind of savings we were looking for. So the timing is right. And that's part of the reason why we're bringing this up to review with the Finance Committee and seek your recommendation that you recommend that to the board, and that the full board approves our entry into a prepayment transaction at the August 11th meeting. So Andrea, if you'll advance the slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of what I'll cover today, I'll go a little bit over the timeline and how we've, the progress we've made on prepay. I'll review a little bit about the background of the prepay structure. A lot of this will be a review. If you remember, we talked about it at the March Finance Committee meeting and then at the April board meeting. We'll talk about the benefits and risks and the potential sizing of the prepay, the estimated fees associated with this transaction, and a quick summary of the number of transaction documents that were included in your package. And then we'll talk about the next steps and then seek your recommendation. Next slide, please.
If I could interrupt just for
Yes.
a moment. We've got two individuals that are on the line that are included in the Zoom call, and they're, I think, important to the Finance Committee understanding this transaction because they're our advisors. Do you want to introduce them briefly?
Yes, my apologies. I completely forgot. So we have Mike Berwanger, who has participated in the past meetings on prepay as well. He's from Public Financial Management. He's our financial advisor on this transaction, and he will be also discussing the prepay and answering any questions you may have on this transactions. And the second person we have.
Is Mike there?
Hey, Mike's on.
Oh, Mike, hey, Mike. We have Mike Mahar, our accountant. He participates in the Finance and Admin Committee meeting and can answer any questions on the accounting side of the equation. Okay, thanks, Brian, for that. So going back to the prepay, so we've been working on this well before my time here, and the effort spans nearly 2 years. And during that time, we've made several presentations to the Finance and Executive Committee meeting. The board authorized we enter into legal service agreements in October of last year. This is when we entered into agreements with our number of professionals, including Mike from PFM, to help us structure and negotiate the transactions. And at the April board meeting, the board authorized that we joined California Community Choice Financing Authority. This is the bond conduit that will issue the prepay, that will issue the bonds. And SVCE is one of the founding members along with 3 other CCAs. So next slide, please. So a little bit on the background of the prepaid transactions. The reason we're doing prepaid transactions is we want to reduce the cost of our power purchases. This is a mechanism with which we have the ability to reduce our cost of power. And I would say that this is a competitive advantage for us CCAs. This is not something PG&E can do because we have ability to access tax-exempt interest rates. And through this structure, we get to legally arbitrage the difference between taxable and tax-exempt interest rates and flow that savings into our power purchases. This structure is not new. It's been around since 1990s. A lot of the transactions that have been done have been on the natural gas side, about 95% of them, total transactions totaling over 50 billion in notional dollar. This is part of the U.S. tax law. It's part of the National Policy Act, so it's codified in the tax law. Our transaction, as you remember, we've been working with East Bay Community Energy, so we are doing this in partnership with them, and we'll split the savings and the size of the deal with East Bay. Next slide, please. So quick review of the prepay structure. And if you remember at the last meeting, we went through each step by step of each of the process, and I will quickly go through those steps. And of course, please feel free to ask me any questions you may have. The term of the transaction is a 30-year transaction. So the bonds will, however, reprice every 5 to 10 years. Now, I can't give you an exact number because we won't know the exact tenor of the initial term of the bonds until we go to the market. And what we'll be looking for is the time period that gives us the largest, the most optimal spread between taxable and tax-exempt interest rates. And we expect that to be somewhere between 5 to 10 years. And after that initial period, we will refinance the bonds, and then the savings will be dependent on the market conditions that will prevail at the time of the repricing of the bonds. The process, the way this works, is that we have contracts with our energy suppliers. And under the prepay structure, what we do is we partially assign that contract to the prepaid bank or prepaid supplier, in our case, Morgan Stanley. So we will partially assign the contract, and Morgan Stanley will then agree for the quantities that are assigned into the prepay that they will pay the contract price to the energy supplier. So that's sort of step one of this. And we assign this using the limited assignment agreement. That's one of the agreement that was included in the package. Then what we've done is we've created CCCFA. So this is a separate legal entity that will issue tax-exempt bonds. These, again, will be non-recourse bonds. They're not guaranteed by CCCFA or SVCE. They're actually guaranteed by Morgan Stanley and secured by the cash flows of the transaction. So CCCFA then issues the bond proceeds in step 3, and then takes those proceeds, and basically, in our case, that could be as large as the principal amount of the bonds could be as large as 1.25 billion. So they would then take that proceeds and give it to Morgan Stanley in the form of prepayment for energy that Morgan Stanley will then deliver to CCCFA. And these two entities will sign a contract called the Prepaid Agreement. That's also included in the package. And this agreement is very similar to the agreement that we will sign in step 5 with CCCFA called the Power Supply Agreement. And what that specifies is that CCCFA, when you deliver And if you deliver megawatts and the associated environmental attributes of the product, then we will pay the contract price less the discount. Now, that discount, again, is funded by the savings we get from the difference between the taxable and tax-exempt interest rates. Then CCCFA uses the proceeds that it collects from us and East Bay and services the debt, makes the principal and interest payments on the debt. So that's sort of a high-level overview of the structure of how the prepay works. Next slide, please. Now a little bit on the benefits and the risks. So the savings are substantial, the risks are minimal. Savings we expect over a 30-year term to be somewhere around 8 to 12% per year. Now, when I quote a percentage savings, it depends on the price of power and of course the spread that we get. We are asking in this transaction that the board authorization be dependent on a minimum saving for the initial term of $3 a megawatt hour. Now, the market fluctuates obviously on a daily basis, and we will execute at a time when we can at least get $3 or more. If we had executed the deal last week, the market was somewhere close to $4. So if we had gotten $4, then that and then depending on the price of power, the 30-year forward curve is probably somewhere around $40 a megawatt hour. So $4 would have translated into a 10% savings. At $3 with the $40 megawatt hour price would translate to about 7.5% savings. Now, the deal that we initially will assign into the prepay is a 3-year deal that we recently completed with Morgan Stanley. That deal was executed at $46. So there, a $3 would translate into 6.5% savings, and a $4 would translate to 8.5% savings. I'm sharing these numbers because we've talked about it before, but the savings we expect, I think, to put it succinctly, will be somewhere around 8 to 12%. But a lot again depends on the price of power. Power prices move up, then on a percentage basis, that number may seem lower, but on a dollar basis, it still equates to somewhere between 1.3 to 1.7 million dollars a year. Again, important point here to emphasize is the debt is not guaranteed or backed by Silicon Valley, but again, it's backed by Morgan Stanley. So what are the risks? The risk is if the transactions for whatever reason were to terminate, we will go back to where we were prior to the prepaid transactions, which means the contract that we partially assigned into the prepay will revert to SVCE under the same terms as we had previously negotiated with the counterparty. And our loss would be we would lose the time and effort that we put into the prepay, as well as any potential future savings that were to be realized. Next slide, please. So the deal size, what we're asking for approval is that the board give us authority to execute up to $1.25 billion. The actual sizing will depend on we go to the market and what we see the market appetite is, but we think from what we've seen in the market, and if you Brian shared with us a Wall Street Journal article that indicated that there's a lot of interest in municipal debt right now because of the high expectations of higher tax rates. So high net worth individuals are looking into municipal debt as a way, investing in municipal debt as a way to minimize their taxes. This talks about inflationary pressures that's driving the spread between taxable and tax-exempt debt. So we think the market we could go out for as much as $1.25 billion on a principal amount of debt. Now, this transaction again will be split with Morgan Stanley. Initially, if you remember, we had talked about sizing as around 700 million, in which case our share would have been 350 million. So now, under this 1.25 billion, we think our share would be somewhere around 500 to 600 million. And again, the execution will be contingent on getting at least $3 or more per megawatt hour savings. Now, one thing to note is that in terms of our portfolio size, the deal that we'll enter into for prepay will be about 10% of our power procurement portfolio. And so there's plenty of room left for future prepays, which we will likely pursue because this is a way of getting additional savings into our portfolio. As I mentioned, the current markets favor a term of 5 to 10 years, and the bonds will reset or be repriced after the initial period, and the future discount will depend on the then prevailing market conditions. But we in the repricing agreement, we are asking for a minimum discount threshold of $2 per megawatt hour. Now, this $2 per megawatt hour is something that we, from a tax perspective, we have to demonstrate that there's at least 80% probability of meeting. We have to demonstrate that for tax purposes, so we can't put necessarily any kind of a number or higher number. It has to meet that threshold that there's 80% probability of us actually hitting the $2 number. Also, in the repricing agreement, of course, a lot will depend on what the market conditions are, but we have put provisions in there that Morgan Stanley engaged with us in the same manner that they engaged with us when we initially priced the deal. We've also put the language in there that we have the right to shop the prepay supplier. So about 6 to 7 months before the repricing period, Morgan Stanley will give us an indicative rate. And if we feel that we can then go to other banks and shop that rate. Now, the provisions we've gotten from Morgan Stanley in the repricing agreement, I would say, are at or above market, these type of transactions, and Mike can speak to that as well. We pushed on these terms very hard for Morgan Stanley to the point where they were willing to walk away because they said they've done a number of deals without having to make these type of concessions. So we think we're getting better than the market conditions for the repricing terms. And the last point here is that for the future repricing periods, one thing we have to remember is as the transaction moves forward, the tenor of the deal will be shorter, and so that will put a downward pressure on what the future discounts will be. So the discounts will tend to be higher, at the initial terms of the deal, holding all else constant, it will tend to be going down. But of course, if the interest rate spreads are much higher, then that will support a higher discount. Next slide. So a little bit about estimated fees. So again, the fees that I've listed here, the transaction fees for a lot of these are for our professional advisors and counsel. Comes to about 1.4 million. These were all competitively solicited services. These fees will be split with East Bay, and they will be paid out of the bond proceeds. So any savings that I'm talking about will be savings that are net of these fees. And on the right side is the underwriter's fee. And that depends on the size of the deal. So if we do, it's directly proportional to the size of the deal. If we did a deal that was half the size, then obviously the 7 million will be half of that.
When you come back, bring me the wipes. Okay? Why?
Next slide, please. So the number of transactions that we have to enter into to engage into a prepaid transactions, and I've listed the major ones here that we will be executing, that we need board authority to execute. The main one being the power supply contract. So this is the agreement that we enter with the CCCFA that says if you give us power, we will pay the contract price less the discount. Then there's a letter agreement regarding assignment of PPA. This is between us, CCCFA, and Morgan Stanley. It details basically the terms of PPA assigning energy supply contracts that we have with either current or a future counterparty, and it basically lays out terms that we will make commercially reasonable efforts to assign a PPA during the reset period. All parties must agree to the assignment. Basically, the letter agreement around how we would be assigning energy supply contracts into the prepay. The third one here is the limited assignment agreement. So this is the assignment agreement we will execute with Morgan Stanley and our third-party energy supplier, where we detail the terms of partially assigning the contract to Morgan Stanley. The fourth one is a project administration agreement, and this is between us to East Bay and CCCFA. This agreement basically sets the terms of coordination between us and East Bay, and also lays out some of the terms where we will be acting on behalf of CCCFA. For example, we'll still be responsible for scheduling energy. It basically lays out our roles and responsibilities in regards to that. There are other terms in there. For example, there may be annual refunds at the CCCFA. For example, funds that we may invest at CCCFA will, the money we put into CCFA, for example, the payments will, before the interest and principal payments are made by CCFA, there's a float period within which those funds can be invested, and how that fund then comes back to us through an annual refund. It lays out terms of those provisions. Then there's the custodial agreement that we will have. This is between us, Morgan Stanley, and a custodian bank. And this basically lays out how we will handle cash flow among all the parties, so we can make so the required payments can be made to the energy supplier. So these are the 5 major contracts that we will sign. The next slide, I'm going to talk about the contracts that CCCFA will sign. So next slide, yes. So similar to the power supply agreement that we signed with CCFA, CCFA then signs a prepaid agreement with Morgan Stanley. And for the most part, this contract mirrors the power supply agreement that we have with CCFA. It lays out the terms of the prepayment and payment by Morgan Stanley to CCFA. The bond proceeds that CCFA will pay to Morgan Stanley, and the terms in which Morgan Stanley will then flow energy to CCFA. There's a trust indenture. This is between CCCFA and the trustee. The trustee is Bank of New York, and it basically sets the terms of bond issuance, rights of the bond holders, and basically secures the cash flow at CCFA to ensure that the timely principal and interest payments are made to the bondholders. There's a repricing agreement I talked about between CCCFA and Morgan Stanley that sets the terms of the remarketing, the repricing of the bonds, and how the calculation of the future discount will be computed. And again, that has the provision in there that there's a minimum of $2 discount. Then there are commodity swap agreements. These are not major agreements, but these are agreements that basically will be between CCCFA and the swap counterparty, and Morgan Stanley and the swap counterparty. And what the swap agreement does is basically converts any index payments made by us or East Bay. East Bay's initial deal that they are assigning will be an index deal. It will basically, working through all the provisions of the swap agreement, will convert the variable pricing to a fixed price so that there's certainty of cash flow as CCCFA with which it can make principal and debt service. Next slide, please. The other document is the preliminary offer statement. So this is used to market the bonds. We provided a copy of this, and we're still working on parts of this statement that we hope to have it finished before we go to the board on the 11th. So this will summarize the key terms of the prepayment transaction. If there is one document you want to read, this is probably one of the documents you could read that provides a good summary on prepaid transaction key terms. It also includes background information on us. Similarly, Eastbay's will include it on Eastbay regarding our customers, our source of clean energy, and it will also include our financial and operational information. Next slide. So with that, we're asking the committee that the committee requests that the support that the board approve this transaction at the August meeting. After the board approves the transaction, this will go to CCCFA board in August 26th. And will be voted by the CCCFA board. Now, the same deal that I'm bringing forward to the committee here, Eastbay got approval from its board in July. And Marin, they're working, MCE, they're working on their own prepaid transaction of about $900 million transaction. And they got approval from their board in July, and they also got approval from the CCCFA board at the August 26th meeting. So after we get the approval from our board in August 11 and from CCCFA on August 26, our target will be to issue the bonds. The timing, again, will depend on market conditions. It could happen in September if the market is there that can give us the savings we're looking for. And as I said, the market is moving favorably. As of last week, it would have supported a discount of close to $4 a megawatt hour. Next slide. Okay, so now with that, we're requesting the Finance and Admin Committee recommend that the board authorize us to enter into a prepayment transaction and specifically execute the agreements listed on the slide, and that the board's authorization be subject to the fact that the bonds that will be issued by CCCFA is not guaranteed obligations of SVCE, but only limited obligation of CCCFA that's payable by the revenues that are securing this transaction and backed by the guarantee of Morgan Stanley. The aggregate principal amount of the bonds not to exceed $1.25 billion. Again, this is in partnership with Eastbay, and that we get at least a $3 per megawatt hour savings for the initial term of the bonds. And I think that concludes my presentation on this. I'll take questions now.
Do we have any questions from the board? We've got Liz, you've got your hand raised?
Yes, please. As the phrase goes, thank you very much. I think you get a PhD, but I think the rest of us should get a PhD on this, given all the information. It's extraordinary, and I thank you very much for the thoroughness and completeness of the packet that you provided. Very, very helpful. So I just have a couple of questions. You made a statement, and I think I got it after your summary just now. You said something about an agreement you made with Morgan Stanley last week, and I think it was if you had made an agreement with Morgan Stanley last week. There were no agreements with Morgan Stanley last week, right?
Yeah, I can't remember what I said now. So there's no, we have not executed any deal transactions with Morgan Stanley related to prepay until we get the board transaction. Now, there's a commodity transaction we executed with Morgan Stanley that's part of our normal course of managing our portfolio. And that was competitive solicited with Morgan Stanley and another supplier. We will be novating, our intent is to partially assign that agreement into the prepay.
But that's more knowledge than the board needs.
I'm sorry?
I think that's more knowledge than the board needs.
Yeah, so
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So that might have slipped in. I don't think you need to do
yes.
it if it did.
Yeah. That's just normal course of business, you're right.
Right, okay. The second is, has this been discussed with each board member at this point, or are you planning to discuss it with each board member?
Maybe we put the slide. We have discussed it with all the board members, I think multiple times. You know, if you look at the board meetings and executive committee meetings and finance committee meetings, but not since the last meeting we've had. Yeah.
With this whole packet.
Yeah, since April 2021, we have not had further discussions with the board.
Are you planning on, the reason I'm asking is there is an extraordinary amount of detail here.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if there is a more streamlined presentation, if you have a comfort level that the board is following. We want to keep the public informed, obviously, but in terms of, I'm going to call it the transaction steps and so forth, I'm not sure how much we need. The last two slides, I think, were very good in summarizing the agreements. Oops. Because that's the nitty gritty of it. And then also, I think this dress, just simply, you know, saying that this is, this agreement will be approximately 10%. In other words, when you say some of the key points going through it step by step, it's a little hard to follow exactly how it fits. I mean, the basic thing is it's roughly 10%. We can do more. It's a standard agreement. And I think there may be an executive summary up front of what that whole presentation is about. You could really streamline it and then focus on the last slides, which talk about the agreements to be signed. I think that's relevant. But so my comments are, as always, what is it that we can do at the board meeting to, you don't want to lose people because you're conveying too much information. So I'm a little concerned about that, because you took, what, a good half hour? I wasn't timing it, but it was a good bit of time. So think about ways, I strongly encourage what I'm going to call an executive summary slide. I think that would help the public as well as the board. And I thought your comment about the preliminary offering statement was a good one also. I think those were my basic notes. So, I mean, it's superb and very, very exciting. I sent it to the press release to my financial guy who does all of my bonds. I do want nothing but municipal bonds. And he sent back a question, what did I want to run for governor? So thank you very much.
Let's see, do we have any other hands raised? I do not believe so. Chair Rennie is on the line. Would you like to have any words, any questions?
No questions for me. We've seen this quite a few times, and it's only the final details really that are new, so I'm comfortable with it.
Okay.
Brian, we have one more hand raised. Board Member Yvonne Martinez Beltran.
Yes, please go ahead, Yvonne.
Hi, I wanted to ask, wrap my brain around all of this you're doing, which is fantastic. What makes a transaction prime for this? Or better said, I guess, what would prohibit us using this option when we go out to secure our purchase? Can you hear me or no?
No.
You're very garbled.
How about now? No? Here, let me.
That's better, but if you could speak slowly, that would be helpful.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on. What makes a transaction prime for this option? Or I guess better said, what would prohibit us from considering acquiring power using this option?
So there's nothing prohibiting. This is a means of us taking advantage of the fact that we have access to tax-exempt debt without incurring debt on our balance sheet. We can bring that savings into a power, bring down cost of our power procurement. So what
This
we
might
will
be
like,
helpful. I guess what I heard somebody saying, of course we wouldn't do all of our purchase this way. And so I'm
yes.
wondering, why wouldn't we do some of those purchases with this option if there is this savings of 8 to 12%? Why would this not always be the option that we go with, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
Yes, good question. So we will likely do more prepaid transactions and lock more volumes of our portfolio. The only limitation is, and that's not going to be a case for this first deal, is once we get to closer to a level of our portfolio where most of our loads are covered by prepay, is that we have to be, then the tax councils will take a closer look at those additional volumes to make sure that we can always have the load meet the prepay obligations. So when we get to a threshold beyond 80%, 90% of our portfolio, there'll be some fine tuning of volumes that may not quite lead us to 100% because of the probability of not always having municipal load back this. But at the threshold where we are, that's not a concern. But yeah, but to answer your question, we will be doing more of this because it is a means of lowering our cost of business.
Okay, thank you. I had another question. Oh, yes. The other question is, so as you're coming to the board this time on our first purchase, will that be the protocol for purchases in the future?
Well,
you can't hear me.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, if I may, Amrit, I think from a power procurement perspective,
I'll put it in the chat.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think if I heard the question was, as you go forward, would this come back to the board, in a similar fashion? And I think the way to best think of this is, your power procurement efforts will continue to move forward in the same manner that you do them today. And this financial component sort of then takes some of those contracts and bolts on to those contracts. You take those contracts from your power procurement efforts that are in your portfolio, and you can put them into this transaction. So the power procurement will continue to move forward in the way that you've designed it today. Any transactions such as this would come through this committee, and then would separately come through the board if you decided to do a couple more of these, as Amrit has suggested. You might look at that from time to time.
Thank you. Yes, that was what I was asking, if we would be reviewing any future purchases through. Thank you.
I think we're okay. I didn't hear all of what you said. Oh, I see Rob Rennie's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I thought of a question. I'm trying to remember if I asked this before, and if I did, I don't remember the answer. One thing that sounded a little strange to me is we're talking about taking out 30-year bonds, I think we said, but our long-term power purchase agreements are much shorter than that. So that means Morgan Stanley's taking out a 30-year bond against these, a revenue stream that ends long before the bond has to be paid off. That sounds a little strange to me.
So the power supply contract we will execute with CCCFA, and then CCFA executes a prepaid agreement with Morgan Stanley, is for a 30-year power purchase commitment. So we are signing a 30-year deal. The expectation is that we get to assign in at a future date any additional contracts we need into the prepay structure. So initially, we're going to assign a contract that has a term of 3 years. But when that term ends, we will assign in another one of our energy supply contracts into the prepay structure. So there will be assignment in there, and that's laid out in the agreement that we will make our best efforts to assign energy contracts into the prepaid transactions.
So I think what you're saying is, even if we're taking out a 30-year bond, some of our contracts are, I can't remember, 10-year, 15-year, maybe 20-year contracts. I don't think they're 30 years, but if the agreement is when those end, we will sign something else in there to finish paying the bond. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, we will assign future PPAs or energy supply contracts into the prepay. Our deal is a 30-year commodity deal. It's backed by our load. We have the municipal load to back that up.
Okay, backed by the load, not necessarily by the contract.
Well, it's backed by
the
power supply contract we execute, but in there's terms that we will novate in additional, we'll assign in additional contracts as needed.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see any other hands raised. What I'd like to do is just, since I've been involved with this and other transactions, as you went through your slide deck, it raised a number of issues for me / comments. And I wonder if we could just go through that. And I know that we're pushed for time, but I could give you my thoughts as a alternate board member and what I see in the update materials. If you can do that, Andrea, please. Just start at the beginning, and I'll just make comments and ask you to advance the slide.
Sure, just one moment.
Yep. And it's 9:54, and I think I've scheduled until 11. Is that the time that we had scheduled for this meeting? Because I've got a hard stop at 11.
Yes.
Okay. Next slide. I think the key thing here is it's 2 years, so this is going to happen, and that's a good thing. Next slide. To me, one of the most important things is that bullet point at the very bottom is that I'm very comfortable with our professionals that are involved in this, so that's a good thing. Next slide. This one we've been through a number of times. Next slide. Oh, the one thing that's missing on this is how the swap agreements work. And go to the next slide, please. Under the risks, this is a question. It's the loss of savings and back to square one. How will there was a certain point if we went forward with this and we didn't receive the proceeds and we went with the bond rating, we would lose the cost of that bond rating. When do we pull that trigger? And that I think is a risk, although it's minimized. And perhaps you go to the next slide. If I remember correctly, the numbers are on the next slide. Oh,
It's, yeah.
One more.
One more, yeah. Right here.
Amrit, I could jump in if you want.
Yep.
Brian, just to answer your question on the rating agencies, we will, once both parties, SVCE and EBCE, have received board approval, at that point, we will send it over to the rating agencies. We're very close, as Amrit described, on just about any given week, you could have executed at the levels that you're desiring. If in the off chance, we cannot get this done, there is about a 3 to 6 month window where the rating is still good. So nothing will change. And then, usually around the 6 month mark, if you still haven't executed, Moody's would then sort of, place a phone call and sort of check in to see where things are at. And they're pretty flexible, but it is true that at some point they will want payment for their services.
Okay. So that's the 315,000.
Correct, and that number, by the way, is also a maximum number. There's a base fee with a complexity adjustments based upon their review, which we don't actually expect to be as high as this. It should be closer to 250, 260 is our expectation.
Okay. Can you go back a slide, please? So on this one, aggregate principal amount will not exceed 1.25 billion, and it'll be split. Do we have any parameters on that split? We've kind of talked, you've talked about it, but there's nothing that's in an agreement in there that how the split is going to be.
Yeah, I can talk to that. So what we've agreed with East Bay is that we're targeting about 10% of our portfolio, so that's going to be 50 megawatts. So that may be, if we issue 1.25 billion, our share would probably be somewhere between 500 to 600 million, and the rest would go to East Bay, them being the larger CCA.
Okay, you just answered that question. I don't have a feel for their size. So you're saying they are larger, and their appetite could go up to taking the full remainder of the amount.
Correct. They're about 7 terawatt hours, and we're about 4 terawatt hours.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay, next slide. And the underwriter's discount, the takedown, those are the fees payable to the bond salespeople. Is that correct, Mike?
That's correct. That's the sales credit, if you will. It's calculated per bond, so it is, you know, there's a direct one-for-one correlation. If you sell half the bonds, this fee is half the number.
Okay. Next slide. So power supply contract, better agreement, limited assignments. So number 3, item 3, this is all the novation, and that would be written into our future contracts, power purchase contracts, correct? This is where we have to go back and rewrite them, but going forward, we will include that, correct?
Yes, so our contracts, some of the newer contracts do have some language in there about our ability to assign that. But now that we have the form agreement, we will include that in our future contracts. And with our existing suppliers, we are going back and asking them to enter, some of them to enter into this. And some of them are quite familiar, having done this on the gas side of the deal.
Okay. So it'll be simplified going into the future. So to get to one of the other board members' questions, we will be able to do this in a much more expeditious manner in the future.
Correct.
Okay. And then number 4, the CCCFA, that is, there's no board members that are on that are from any public agency. That's all internal to SVCE, East Bay, correct?
Yeah, so there's 4 founding CCAs that formed CCCFA. We're one of them. East Bay is the other. The other 2 are 3CE, Community Central Community Choice in Monterey, and Marine Clean Energy. And each of the CCAs has one representative on the board. Ours is Grish.
And he is the chair.
The chair is Nick Chesset from EBCE, and Grish is the vice chair.
Okay. Understood. Next slide, please. So the one issue that I don't understand, and we don't have to talk about it, but the number 4, the commodity swap agreement. So that's what's not on the slide, but on the transaction slide. But that is, well, I guess that's standard with any floating price contract.
Yes.
You want to have it go to a fixed price.
Yes, it's not a significant part of the transaction. If I were to include it into the diagram, it would become quite a complicated diagram needlessly, and it's not going to convey the main terms of the prepay structure. So this is basically there are 2 swap agreements. One is between CCCFA and the swap counterparty. The other is between Morgan Stanley and the swap counterparty. And all it's doing is basically, if we make index payments, it takes the index payments that we make into the prepay, basically gives it to Morgan Stanley, takes a fixed payment from Morgan Stanley, and gives it to CCCFA. So CCCFA always ends up with a fixed price payment. So its cash flows are certain. There's no variability in the cash flows, which then, of course, makes all the cash flow numbers work, making the debt and bond service. So there's no one is subject to market risk here. CCCFA is not subject to market risk on the commodity side.
Okay. Next slide, please. I would underscore that this would be a very interesting document. And when are you going to have a draft of that?
So there's a draft that was included in the package. There's some information about SVCE that's missing, and we're working hard to get those completed.
Okay.
But the terms of the bond and how prepay, the key terms of the prepay, are there, that's all there.
Next slide. Yeah, so our August meeting, we're going to recommend, well, we're going to have a vote on recommending this go forward. And then immediately later in the month, it's the CCCFA board approval. And that's the full board of CCCFA. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Not just participants. And then issue the bonds in September. Okay.
We're going to target in September, but I should just footnote that the actual timing will depend on market conditions, but the market seems to be there.
Right, so everything will be completed so that it can happen in September. Not that it will happen, but it can happen in September.
Correct.
Okay, next slide. Okay. And then we have had Mike Marr review this transaction so that the line that says will not be guaranteed obligations of SVCE has been validated and verified. Is that correct, Mike?
I haven't reviewed this particular bond, but I've looked at Rain Clean Energies. It does appear that is the case. It's the way these are structured. But we do still need to review the SVCE bond issue.
Understood. And I'm sorry, is MCE a client of yours or not?
Yeah, sorry, they are, and they are also doing a similar transaction, although with a different bank. But I believe the essence of the structure is extremely similar.
Okay. Well, that's good news. Next slide, please. Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to go through and give the other committee members sort of what my thoughts are on this as far as doing due diligence on behalf of the board. So I'm very comfortable with this now, and thank you for answering all those questions. So let me bring it back to the board and ask, or the committee, and ask if there's any further questions. Otherwise, I think we can go for a motion.
Vice Chair, if we could, we do have two members of the public. I don't know if we'd like to open up public comment.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Open up for public comment.
Any members of the public, please raise your hands if you'd like to make a comment. I see no hands raised and I do not have any written comment.
Okay. I'm looking for a motion.
I move that the committee recommend to the board approval of the power prepay agreements.
Okay, we've got a motion and we need a second. And, Mr. Klein, go ahead.
I'll second that.
All right, we have a motion and a second, and maybe have a roll call vote, please.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I will start with Chair Rennie.
Yes.
Vice Chair Mekachuk.
Aye.
Gibbons.
Aye.
Martinez Beltran. Martinez Beltran, are you there? We'll come back. Klein? Alternate Director Klein? Let's see.
It says you lost him.
Okay, looks like we lost.
Aye.
Thank you, Director Martinez Proton. So that motion does carry with looks like Director Klein is.
So we've got, do we still have a quorum if Director Klein is not on the call? He dropped off?
Yes, we need 4 members to have a quorum, and we have exactly 4.
Okay, so motion carries.
Director Klein did make the second, so hopefully he will rejoin us.
Yeah. Okay. If he comes back on, then we can circle back. So
Yeah, he just texted me that he's on phone audio. He's listening, but somehow he's unable to be heard. Just one sec. Internet. He may be one of the attendees. Let me just double check. Sorry, I'm going to put you on. Hold on one sec. Andrea, he is one of the attendees with the last 3 digits, 675. If you can promote him in, we should then be able to hear him.
Absolutely. And alternate Director Klein, are you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry, there's been internet issues or Wi-Fi issues at City Hall. So,
not to worry.
But I am. I've been calling in as a backup just in case my unstable connection had an issue. But yes, I do vote yes.
Great. Thanks so much. That motion carries.
Thank you.
Perfect. With that, we'll move to item 4, recommend approval of the FY 2021-22 proposed operating budget.
Chair, this is Director Martinez, but I'm also having the same issue as Director Klein. So I'm calling in on 646-808-6593. And then also zooming it from 619-994-2552. So I just want Andrea to know if you see those numbers, it's me. I don't think you could hear me when I was calling. Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. So we can move ahead with the item 4 then on the agenda, correct?
Okay, so now we get to talk about the budget for the upcoming fiscal year. Next slide, please, Andrea. So the way I'm going to approach this presentation is I'll talk about the budget approval timeline, where we are in the process and the next steps. We'll talk about how the outlook looks with respect to PG&E's generation rate and the PCIA and what it does to our headroom or margin or ability to charge our customers. Then I'll go through the proposed budgets, talk about the breakdown of the expenses, and we'll notice, and again, we presented some of these concepts at the executive committee meeting in the end of June, and we had given them a preview of the budget as well, and we had talked about high power prices, which continues. We'll talk about our operating expenses, which are coming in higher, new staffing positions, and something that's not new, we've discussed with the board before, which is to give more authority to the CEO to make staffing decisions. So we're proposing to make CEO as the personnel officer. We'll look into our financial reserves and the necessary revisions that need to be made to our reserve and budget policies to basically manage manage the day-to-day business, the nature of our business, and we'll talk more about this, and we'll have a review of the external risks. So with that, we'll begin with the analysis on the margin on the next slide. Oh, no, sorry, the timeline. So as I mentioned, we previewed the budget at the June 28th executive committee meeting. We're presenting to the finance committee meeting today, and we're seeking your approval of the budget. We will present the draft of it at the August 11th board meeting. We will then take any feedback, any comment, any changes, and incorporate them, and we'll present it at the September 8th meeting for the adoption by the full board. And then, similar to prior years past, in March, we will do a mid-year review and adjustment of the budget. So that's where we are on the timeline. We'll start with the next slide on the margin. So the good news, unlike the current fiscal year, the good news for the upcoming fiscal year is that we're looking at substantially improved margins. And that, again, is coming from higher PG&E generation rates. The current rates are at 10.95 cents on average. We expect that to go to slightly more than 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's about a 9.5% increase. And as you know, we price our rates relative to PG&E, and we're keeping a 1% discount. So a higher PG&E rate means higher headroom margin for us. But the bigger news here is the PCIA, which our customers pay to be a CCA customer. And that's going to have a substantial decrease of about 47%. And that's not a surprise because this year power prices have been high. And what high power prices, while it drives up our costs, our power procurement costs, it has a positive impact in terms of the PCIA because the money that PG&E needs to collect for their above market or stranded costs investments basically goes down because those relative to the market are not as out of the money. So that brings down the PCI significantly. We expect that to come down by about 47%. Now, having said all of that, these are forecast rates, and these rates are very comparable to what PG&E filed in their June error application. Now, PG&E will make an update error application sometime around October, November timeframe, but those rates will be voted by the CPUC at their last meeting in December. So we won't know the final rates until December or beginning of January when the rates will be in effect. So we don't want to count on the money until we see the rates. So we are recommending to keep our discount at 1%. And then when the rates are known, then basically consider revising the discount at that time. So again, the improved margin, as you'll see on the next slide, is what's driving our higher revenues. So that will go to the next slide. So you can see the current mid-year budget. At the time we adopted the mid-year budget for the current fiscal year, we're forecasting to be in the red by about $6 million. For the next fiscal year, we're forecasting an improvement, and we're expecting to add to our net position by about $36.5 million, so about a $42.5 million improvement in margin. Again, the big line, if you look at the revenue line, that's the biggest improvement there. And that's, again, because of what we talked about in the previous slide. Our margin, our ability to charge our customers at a higher rate and still remain competitive and lower price than PG&E is what's contributing to these large increase in revenues. And you can see our power supply costs are coming in higher, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides. And our operating margin is substantially improved, again, because of the higher revenues. And operating expenses are coming in about $5.2 million higher than the previous fiscal year. And we'll talk about that in detail as well. Was there a question?
Yes. that number 6025, that should have parentheses around it, correct? And that's why it's in red?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Good point. Next slide, please. So again, the breakdown of our costs, no different than any other year. When we talk about our expenses of 300 or so million, about 90% or more is power supply expenses. So this is a quick reminder that when we talk about expenses, a big chunk, the biggest chunk is power supply, and our other operating expenses are much lower relative to our total expenses. Next slide, please. So looking into our power supply costs, we're estimating that to be about close to 274 million. The big reason, as you know, is that the power prices have come up significantly since last year, and that's due to the tight supply-demand balance. And we are heading into the fiscal year, we're 82% hedged. So about 18% on an expected basis is still exposed to the market. And that's a key word, is expected basis, right? We hedge based on our expected load forecast, but load forecast is variable. I mean, it can go up or down, and that can increase the risk of the portfolio. The cost of our carbon-free and attributes are also higher, again, because of the low hydro conditions, or ability to find clean resources are scarce, and they're driving up the prices. Our resource adequacy requirements, which are changing and are very expensive at this time to source. So all of these things are driving up the power supply costs. What's helping with our power supply costs is our long-term PPAs that we've signed. They will start trickling online towards the fourth quarter of this year and into 2022. And those were locked in at lower prices, and that helps basically put downward pressure on prices. And these contracts are quite in the money. They have a substantial mark-to-market value. Okay, next slide. So when we're talking about our operating expenses, as I mentioned, we're just coming in about 5 million higher than the previous fiscal year. These are the main components of it. One is we are now putting in place the PPAs, long-term PPAs that we've signed. So there are costs associated with scheduling coordination services. A lot of these contracts were signed with in partnership with 3CE. So we have staffing that we had to secure to basically work out the coordinations. There's technical portfolio modeling support, CAISO integration related costs, legal support. That's about adding $550,000. The staffing, we talked about staffing and we are resource constrained. So we're adding about 6 new positions. Our current authorized headcount is about 32. So we're proposing that we go to 38. And I'll talk about that in the next slide, as where these additions will be made in. And that adds to about 2.6 million. Then we have the business process optimization, and we've talked about this before too. So these are processes to basically help the organization move up from a startup phase. They're standard ways of managing a power procurement portfolio. There's certain systems and tools and processes we need in place. And typically these are called energy trading and risk management systems and tools. So we are in the process of creating a detailed implementation roadmap, and we expect to start implementing pieces of this roadmap in the next fiscal year. And we're budgeting about $900,000 for that. So these will include IT systems, building a data warehouse, expanding our existing data warehouse, looking into some third-party contracts like deal capture systems, how we capture deals, how we then flow those transactional data to all the downstream applications, such as scheduling systems, such as portfolio risk management systems. We have improvements to our cybersecurity. We are undergoing current security gap analysis with some third-party vendors. We expect the mitigations that will be identified through that process. We're budgeting about $150,000 for that. And then we're putting a 5% contingency on our operating costs, and that brings us to $5 million. Next slide. So our new staffing positions, the 6 new positions, we have 1 position coming in our account services organization, and this is to basically lead the implementation of programs, all the programs that we're designing. We have an additional resource in our Power Resources group, Power Resources Manager that's going to see the current implementation of the PPAs that are coming online. We're looking for a compliance manager in our LNR group, Regulatory Legislative and Regulatory group, to centralize all our regulatory compliance reporting obligations. And in the finance organization, we are hiring a human resources generalist. So as the organization is growing, right now we outsource a lot of our human resources functions, which we will continue to do. But there is enough of a need right now, given the turnovers, to have a dedicated person responsible for administering all the benefits, recruiting effort, and as we're transitioning to a hybrid work environment, that also will create a lot of human resources needs, such as benefits, for example. If we have people that are outside of our area working for us, how do we provide competitive benefits in locations outside, potentially California? So those are some of the additional work that's coming down on the HR side. So we need a dedicated person for that. We're looking for a senior risk manager to manage all the risks of our procurement portfolio. So these are typically called the middle office functions. These include counterparty credit risk analysis. A lot of our contracts are in the money. The risk areas of the counterparty which were to renege on them. We would be back to market price risk, how we manage counterparty credit risk. And a lot of the instruments to manage counterparty credit risk are around posting collateral and margin, what that can do to our liquidity position. There are a lot of quantitative, heavy analytical needs that we need to basically model. And some of the mid-office functions that we're outsourcing, we also want to have an inside view as well. So that's a very key position for us. And the last one here is the technology services manager. All the business process optimization work that I talked about, building of the data warehouse, integration of third-party tools, flow of data amongst these tools requires a dedicated technology person to basically not only implement, but maintain them going forward. Next slide, please. So we talked about this before, that we need flexibility to manage the organization. So we're asking that we designate the CEO as the Chief Personnel Officer. So our current practice right now is any modifications of job titles, headcount changes, salary adjustments, org chart changes, they all go to the board. We're asking is that the board provide the flexibility to the CEO to manage the organization, where the CEO can approve job titles, salary ranges, org chart changes, swap positions, add positions. But in the budget policy, we're noting that the additions cannot exceed more than 10% of the authorized number shown in the budget, and also cannot exceed the authorized budget. So all changes the CEO can do has to be within the authorized budget. And any changes that are made will be communicated to the board in a timely manner. Next slide, Andrea, please. So looking at our reserves, the good news is we have healthy reserves. We expect to end the year somewhere around $160 million of cash on hand. we have a line of credit with our bank of 35 million that we, for the most part, do not use. And given our substantial cash position, a reserve position, I should say, and improved margin, it's not really effective or prudent for us to renew that 35 million because we will not be tapping into it. So we're proposing to let that line of credit expire in October, and that can save us about $150,000 a year. But what we're proposing is that we self-fund that level of liquidity that the line of credit provided us. So the line of credit, depending on the year's operating expenses, provided about 30 to 50 days of cash on hand. So as a result, what we're asking is that we adjust our targets up. Our target for the minimum currently is 90 days. We're saying, let's add 30 days to that and bring it to 120 days. And the target reserve from 180 to 230 days, and the maximum from 270 to 320 days. So that's the change we're making in the reserve policy. Next slide, please. So we've talked about this concept at the mid-year budget, and we said we'll come back and revisit it at a policy level. But to manage the organization, there has to be a certain level of work. I would call it almost like working capital or ability to use the reserves. The way the current reserve policy is drafted, it says the reserves can only be used at the discretion of board of directors, and the CEO has to make recommendation to the board for use of reserves. But the nature of our business is that we are subject to the market and the market conditions. And it so happens that our fiscal year ends at the most volatile period in the electricity markets, which is at the end of the summer. So we could go into the summer thinking that we could be within our approved budget, but because of, let's say, a heat wave comes in, which will drive our demand. And usually when the demand goes up in a heat wave, the power prices also goes up. So you'll have a higher cost, not only because of serving that incremental load, but also because of higher prices. And we can easily exceed the budget and not have the time to come back to the board. So we need some level of flexibility to manage that portfolio. And we had talked to the executive committee and we talked about a number somewhere around 20 million. Rather than using a fixed number, we thought let's tie it to the power cost of power purchases, the power purchase budget, and revise the reserve policy to allow us to use up to 10% of the budgeted cost of power supply for variability that may come from power supply expenses, either due to higher load or higher prices, or revenue fluctuations in years where we think we were going to get the revenue, but due to load departure, let's say we did not get the revenues. Or there could be collateral and margin posting requirements, which are not costs at the time when we post it, but these are credit mechanisms that are in place in our contracts, similar to margin calls you may get on your investment portfolio. We have margin or often called collateral calls for forward contracts that we also require flexibility in use of reserves. So we're asking that the board approve, using reserves of up to 10%, and anything above that, we'll seek board approval. We think that should be enough for us. If we going into the year, we think we're going to need more than 10%, we will then come to the board and seek that level of approval. Next slide, please.
We do have a hand raised. I don't know if Chair Rennie has a question.
I do have a question if you want me to ask it now.
Yeah, you can ask it now.
So I wanted to ask about the 10%. It sounds like a big number. We're talking about 10% of our total power supply costs, which are 90% of our costs for the year, and we're talking about raising our reserves to 90 days, which is about 25% of a year. So that means that he has discretion to use up to about 40% of our reserves.
No, just the 10% of the budgeted cost of power. So the cost of power is 274 million. So let's say 27 million of that.
And our reserve target now is how much?
Our reserve target will change from 180 to 230 days.
Oh,
So this
okay.
is a dollar amount. We're saying, let's say if reserves are 160 million, out of that 160 million, whatever the reserve is, if we were to dip it, we can use up to 27 million of that for these sort of non-discretionary expenditures. None of these are discretionary, right? These are cost to serve our load or fluctuations due to revenue or margin and collateral postings. But anything that's yeah, go ahead.
I was just trying to understand sort of what percent of our reserve could be used without authorization. And so I think you just said the reserves are sit about 180 million. So 27 million of that can be used. So that sounds like a neighborhood of 15% or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's about, yeah. It's
that's really what all I wanted to understand.
Yeah, 15-16%.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Not very well, Director Martinez-Beltran. Which of the numbers was yours? I'm sorry, was it the 646 area code?
Yes.
Okay, I will unmute that. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So I'm sorry, but I had a similar question as Director Rennie was asking. When you talk, and I was trying to interrupt and say, could you repeat that? Could you? But I guess you couldn't hear me. When you're talking about the 10%, you say additions will not exceed the 10% of authorized number shown in the budget. So what is that amount? Is that the 230 million or the 160 million? What is that amount, the 10%?
So it's 10% of the budgeted cost of power supply. So it's about 27 million for the upcoming fiscal year.
Okay. And when you say, we can't exceed 10% of the authorized number, so you can't exceed the 27 million for what? For everything? For what is that 27 million going to cover?
So so the 27 million, we're saying if we were to use reserves, we could dip in for 27 million. So that's one. And the other is that the power supply expenditure could be 10% higher, because what we're saying is if I'm giving you in the budget a power supply expenditure of about 274 million. What I'm saying is I cannot with 100% certainty hit that 274 million. As an organization, we can, no one can. Power supply is a traded product. Its price will go up and down. When we projected our portfolio cost at the June executive committee meeting, at that time we were at 260 million. Now we're at 274 million. If I were to run the portfolio again next week, it will be a different number.
Okay,
that
so
number
there's a 10% flat.
Yeah. Yes. So it's to basically account for primarily the variability of a power supply cost.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Yep. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, please, Andrea. So this is, again, a reminder of the risks that we face as an organization. There are a number of risks. The cyber risk we've talked about before, the supply risk, PPAs may may not come on target dates. The rules are changing around RA. There's legislative regulatory risks, there's payment risks, collateral posting risks, load draws, PCI generate. So we do need to maintain and keep a healthy reserves. And that's why, even though we're letting the line of credit expire, we're adding those additional days and ensuring that in years like the upcoming fiscal year, where we have the opportunity to build reserves, we do want to do that because of these uncertain risks we face in our business. With that, I'll go to the next slide, please. So in summary, the upcoming fiscal year, the financial outlook is very good. The power supply and operations costs are increasing. The biggest risk is that even though we're saying the upcoming year is good, it's based on a forecast number. We won't know until the end of the year what the actual rates are. So we're proposing to keep the 1% customer discount rate and revisit it once the rates are better known. We're updating our reserve policy and budget policies to allow staff to use reserve funds and to exceed the budgeted cost of power supply by about 10% to respond to market volatility and or revenue fluctuations. We're asking to increase our reserve targets. I've said 50 days, but 50 days is for the target and the maximum. For the minimum, we're adding 30 days. And we're proposing to eliminate line of credit because we don't really tap into that line of credit, and we have sufficient reserves. And if at any future point in time we need the line of credit, we can re-engage with our bank and can probably put the line of credit in place within about 2 months, is what we talked to the bank about. Andrea, next slide, please. So with that, we're asking that that you approve the proposed operating budget, recommend the board to consider in the August meeting, and then for the board to adopt at the September meeting. Approve the updated budget and reserve policy, and the resolution authorizing the CEO to become the Chief Personnel Officer. And I think that was my last slide. Yes.
Okay, we've got Director Klein has a question. Go ahead.
Sure, and please tell me if you have any audio issues as far as that's concerned.
We can hear you well, thanks.
Good. So from a communication standpoint, I just wanted to kind of go through from the budget, and looking at, I understand we're looking at what the issues are concerning rates. And, and I've read several things, PG&E is asking for a 5% rate increase annually for the next 5 years, which has a lot of implications as far as how much money we're seeing and what that, how we want to affect reserves and all that. You say, okay, that decision in January. When does the CPUC make that decision as far as what that rate increase will be? And then when do we actually adjust those rates as far as you see?
So I think there's a couple of things. So a lot of PG&E's rate increases that they're talking about will be part of their general rate case application. So that's a separate application.
Okay.
Some of that may flow into the generation rate, which will affect us, but a big chunk of what they're talking about, I think, is on the distribution and transmission rates. The PCIA and the gen rate that we're talking about, the PG&E made a forecast error application in June, which is in line with the projections I'm showing in the presentation. They will make an update filing of the error application sometime around October, November timeframe, and the PUC will vote on those rates at their last meeting in December, for the rates to then take into effect in January, and that's the rates that we're reflecting in the budget. But a lot of the general rate case will have future implications. Some of that may flow into the generation, but a big chunk of that is going to be on T&D side.
Okay, and that's actually helpful. I appreciate that. And so from, so when they specify what their new rates are going to be, what's the time frame that we will actually need to take action? And I understand it's not specific to the budget, but it does kind of set what the second half of that fiscal year really looks like.
Yeah, so we will know the rates end of the December, so in January. So sometime I would say around January, February timeframe is when we would, if we feel, we'll have a discussion with the board and the committees as to what the future projection looks like and what, if any, changes we should be making. So it'd be around that January time, and Grish probably has a comment.
Yeah, just to put a finer point on it, what we tend to do in December, we have a much better idea and a higher degree of confidence on what PG&E's rate is going to be. So in past years, we have come to the board with a recommendation that's almost like, if this, then that. So then we get really prepared, because it takes about 3 weeks or so to get all the rate schedules updated in the billing system that Calpine runs for us. And we don't want to have too much time lagging between our rates and PG&E's rates. So we've come to you with a delegation of authority saying, if PG&E's rates result in, say, a $35 million margin, let's go with a 3% discount. If it's a $25 million margin, let's go with a 2% discount. So we do a little bit of a if this, then that, so we can move fast.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And definitely there's a lot of variability from a budgetary standpoint. I totally appreciate that. From the long term, and this is just kind of looking at it as how we run our budget. So this is kind of my first year kind of going through the budget. I was a little surprised that we're, approving, and I understand approving the fiscal year budget, but not looking a little bit farther into the future. From our city standpoint, we have to have a 10-year balanced budget and a 20-year plan. And not that we need that for this organization, but trying to see at least what kind of, at least trying to do some larger forecasting. And I know there's kind of an addendum slide on the forecast, but being a little more formal from an organizational standpoint on what we think the long-term reserves will be, what our goals are, whether or not we meet those goals or those change on a yearly basis. I was just wondering what your take on that is, and we might want to talk offline, but I'd be interested for at least a short answer.
Yeah, so Andrea, there's a slide in the appendix that has the 5-year forecast. Maybe you can go to that slide, please. So the reserves projections that I showed are based off of these numbers that Andrea is going to put up.
The last slide in the packet or the presentation.
Thank you.
So the key driver of our 5-year outlook is, what do we assume for PG&E's generation rate and the PCIA. So we work with a consultant, we use their model, and again, it's based off that forecast. And the numbers you see at the bottom are what we're saying could be additions to our reserves. But if you look at the highlighted number, you'll see that we're setting aside about $55 million for uncertainty. And what we're saying is that uncertainty could be to manage PCIA and gen rate, adverse movements in PCIA and PG&E's generation rate adverse to us, or power supply cost changes. Otherwise, if we remove that, that $55 million would go to the bottom line. So we're being cautious in how we're projecting our reserve positions. Otherwise, we would show reserves hitting our maximum targets and exceeding it. But again, because of such high degree of uncertainty, we don't want to show the level of projections. We do think we need this yellow, this highlighted area of buffer in our 5-year projection. So that's the assumptions we've made. The cost of electricity that we've modeled are based on market observable prices and our portfolio position. So those are modeled at a very detailed level, including accounting for when our PPAs come online with open position met at the current forward market prices. And the operating expenses, we don't have a lot of insight into what the future will hold. So we're projecting about a 5% increase on an annual basis. And that is how we came up with these projections.
And I appreciate that. I would just, in the main budget as we approve it, having a little more detail on this chart. I think, just having a little more analysis on that 5-year forecast, I do think would be useful in the long term, and not that it's required, but I do think it helps looking at the long-term viability of this organization. And I understand, there's a lot of things that we're kind of on a yearly and or almost a quarterly, monthly basis responding to either the cost of power or what PG&E is doing, what the PUC is doing, other laws, all the variability that you've already talked about. But I do think it's important that we kind of break these down on, going forward, looking out a few years, what might change or what we're having to deal with. So that's just and I'll talk to Gary offline on what we might be doing in future years. But I do appreciate it's not an easy task. Doing that forecasting is never easy. What the models look like and all that. But it does, I think, help us from an organizational standpoint of figuring out where we see flexibility and positivity, and then on a year-by-year basis, just how well we did in our view last year, and kind of what the future might hold. So that's all my comments. Thank you.
Correct. Good points. Yes.
If you can just put that slide back. Sorry about that. If you look at, for 2022, the $36.5 million, and then you put that into the context of the what's highlighted in yellow there, that's like 55 million a year where it could swing, and that 55 million basically dwarfs everything else. So it would be good to have that 36.5 million in cushion, obviously. Anyways, I just wanted to put that into context. We can continue. Any other comments from the board before I open it up to the public? No hands are raised. Can we, oh, we do. We've got Director Martinez Beltran.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I wanted to comment. I really appreciate Director Klein's comments on the 5-year forecast. So I do appreciate that. And then I wanted to just talk a little bit about the staffing, since it is about half of the increase that we're looking at from 2020 to 2021. And one comment I wanted to make for the additional recruiting support. I'm not sure, in detail what all of that would be, but I would like to just, as a comment that I'll share here, and I'll also share at the board, make sure that we're looking at, as a CCA, we're a public institution, as we're thriving want to make sure that our community is also thriving and getting opportunities that a public institution can offer that private institutions cannot, or organizations, pardon me. And so I want to make sure that we are looking at non-traditional groups for recruitment. I'm not saying that we aren't, but that, so when we're building our local capacity, that our recruiters who are supporting us also understand that. And so that we're not just trying to recruit from renowned, you know, would it be schools or other pools and traditional channels, but also looking at some non-traditional channels to make sure that we get continue our diversity outreach and offering that opportunity to others. So that's one comment I wanted to make. The other one was, how long are we looking? So the change that we're looking as far as to make the CEO to the, I forget what the title was.
Personnel officer.
Chief Personnel Officer, thank you. How long will that be in place? And I guess what are, you know, are there some reviews that come along with that? What does that look like?
So, Girish, did you want to take this one?
Yeah. So, Yvonne, this is based on discussions we've had with the exec committee and board. The way the resolution is set up, this will be delegated to me until such time the board decides it doesn't want to delegate it to me. So it's an open-ended delegation going forward. And as far as review, we don't have anything in terms of review. So basically, we've looked at this, you know, it's many cities and some CCAs. This tends to be quite operational. The board's review comes in approving the labor budget. So that's where you control the budget, but the actual implementation of who gets hired, titles, salaries, benefits would all be delegated to the CEO.
Okay, so one thing is, when we're talking about review one, I would like to see if we could have a point where the board reviews this to see, you know, is this something that we think is a good change as we move forward? So whether that's a 6-month or an annual review to see if this is a good, you know, if everybody feels comfortable with the way that we've moved forward. And all this is just erring on the side of caution. Girish, you've done fantastic, and I have all the confidence in the world in you. But I just think it would be great for us to look at having some type of a review for that. The other comment that I'll make and is really about, you know, I do like, I would like to have see if there was some way to look at, I don't think that we need to be micromanaging everything. I think that I really like that you have the ability, and I like the idea of giving you more flexibility to meet some of the staffing challenges that you guys are finding. I guess I also wonder if there would be some way to have an approval of candidates, something, you know, some type of, or maybe not even approval, but a review of candidates. And just really looking to make sure that this is all looking at if there was an opportunity to have that to avoid any type of controversy for an organization, if there was a candidate that might have controversy, or if there was anything else that would happen. And this would only be at our director level that I'd be interested in something like that. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on that. And again, it doesn't have to be an approval, but maybe even just a review, you know, letting the board kind of know where you're at and who, you know, if there's any potential issues that we should consider.
You brought up 2 points. I think my opinion is on having a review of the personnel officer delegation of authority. I think I'd be happy to do that. Maybe if the rest of the finance committee wants to do that, you could, change the recommendation to say a year from now or 18 months from now. I think 6 months may be too early.
Okay.
I would say at a minimum a year, but maybe 18 months. So that would be first. On the second one, at the director level, for having the board review candidates that I may be selecting, I guess I think that would be quite problematic. We have a very technical organization, and the kinds of skill sets that we are looking at are quite technical. Ability to hire is also predicated on speed to actually get someone in, and people want certainty. So I think if we have to do something where I'm actually not able to provide an offer unless I go to the board, will not only slow down the process, I think, I think from a recruiting standpoint, would be quite a challenge. So that's something that I'm not, so that's my opinion. You asked for my opinion. So thank you.
Yeah. What would you suggest for something, where there was, and again, I'm not talking about approval for the position. I'm thinking about much earlier than that, maybe just even, a review of the candidates, if that's in closed session or something, or a notification of who the candidates are. And really, I'm just looking, to be sure that there's nothing that would bring any type of unnecessary controversy to the organization.
Yeah, again, if you're asking for my opinion, I would not support something like that. I don't think that would be good for the organization to bring candidates for the same reasons into closed session. I think it brings politics into the picture also in ways that can be very unpredictable. I would say the way in which you would be able to control this is through your review of my performance, right? So if I hire people who may be quote unquote controversial and brings a bad name maybe to SVCE, you would basically hold me accountable through my performance appraisal. I think overall, just the kinds of discussions that the board has had in the past of, talking about a vision for the future, the kinds of staff you want, right? The kind of culture you want in the organization. I think that's as far as, that's the kind of board direction you're providing us or providing me, and how I translate it into action. Yeah. Okay. And you've been quite consistent in, talking about, recognizing the difficulty in hiring staff, recognizing the very ambitious goals that the board has, of saying, make sure that this culture that you have continues to be effective. So.
Okay, great. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Girish.
Director Gibbons, you've had your hand raised for a while.
Thank you. I would just offer a couple of points. One is, as part of Girish's annual review, we can clearly evaluate his implementation of this policy. I see that would be part of a standard annual review. So I'm very comfortable seeing that as an important aspect of his review and part of the normal process. There are requirements in here about keeping the board updated as to who's being hired. I think the best thing I could offer is that this is pretty much what every city does with their city manager. The city manager has, at least in my experience with all of our cities, has the authority to hire all of the staff, and the council does not have any authority to approve or disapprove anyone. We don't interview anyone. We don't get involved in the day-to-day operational aspects. So I see this as simply a parallel function. I do think it's been a challenge for the organization to have to constantly go back to the board when changes are needed. So I think this is going to be a substantive improvement in moving quickly in a timely manner, getting quality people that we're looking for. And I think Gresh described the organizational culture that all of the new people would need to fit in to be successful and want to join us, because that I think is pretty explicit. I think the only thing that you've mentioned and others have mentioned in the past is when we do the outreach, we want to be sure to reach out to a broader, more diverse group of applicant resources. I think that's always an ideal, but I will be candid when I say, given the specific skill set that we're looking for, it's going to be tougher. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it and aren't doing it, but it's tougher to broaden the scope with an expectation that that will produce the quality and type of person we want. So I'm comfortable with that change because I think it's the appropriate for the type of organization and consistent with other governmental agencies that I'm familiar with. So I'm supportive of all of the proposals and the changes in the budgets. And I will just offer from experience, the PCIA and the PG&E rate are always challenging. And we're doing the best we can. And hopefully in December, if we need to make a change, January, February timeframe, we'll be teed up to do so. So it's par for the course.
Thank you for your comments. Chair Rennie, do you have any questions or comments?
No, I don't think so. I'm fine.
Great, thank you. I support the requested changes, and my thought is that although the board won't see this in before the changes happen, it would be good on a historical basis, if you will, if you make any changes, Garish, or if the numbers change after the fact, that the board received those exception statements, if you will, rather than asking for approval, you'd be able to say, this is what we had to do and here's why at the next board meeting. And the fact that we meet that the board meets every month, means there's a 30-day lag. But I think then that kind of keeps the board knowledgeable and engaged. So those are kind of my thoughts. And if there's any more, do we have any more discussion on these items? Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I just wanted to kind of I want to agree strongly with what you just said. I think we've talked about this, and what we could do is just a standard item in the CEO report, just talk about staffing updates and just provide that as part and parcel of things, whether hiring the additional 6 positions or if there's a title change. I think the next several months to a year, we're just seeing so much change in the workforce. So I think we will have updates for you, and we'll provide it to you before you ask. So we'll make it part of the CEO report.
Okay. I guess with that, Director Martinez Beltran, do you have any other comments before we look for a motion? Hearing none, then perhaps one of the directors could make a motion.
I'm ready to make a motion, and I'll move to approve.
Okay, we've got a motion. We need a second.
I'll
Second.
second.
Oh, either way.
got a second from Director Klein. And if you could just put the summary slide back up there, Andrea, so it's clear what the motion is. So are we approving the budget, or are we recommending that the board approve the budget? That's a question. And the recommending the budget and the reserve policies, and then the creating the CEO as the chief personnel officer. Could you just clarify that for just one moment? Are we a recommending body, or are we actually an approving body?
Recommending.
Okay. So this is that the Finance and Administrative Committee is recommending to the Board of Directors that they approve the proposed budget, the updated budget reserve policies, and the resolution authorizing the CEO as the Chief Personnel Officer. May we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, thank you. We'll start with Chair Rennie.
Aye.
Vice Chair Makachuk.
Aye.
Gibbons.
Aye.
Martinez Beltran.
Aye.
Klein.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries.
Great, thank you very much. And if we just go back to the agenda, that's item 4, committee/staff remarks before we adjourn. We're at 10 minutes after 11. I don't see any hands raised. And I see one new member of the public, but that's, I guess that's the only thing. Then I will, if there's nothing else, we've finished the items. I will adjourn the meeting. Okay, thanks everyone.